There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to another episode in our series, Why Podcasts Work. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles, Director of Partnerships here at Sweetfish Media. I am joined today by Eric Piela. He is the head of brand and buzz at CoSchedule. He's also the host of the Actionable Marketing Podcast. Eric, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks so much, Logan. Great to be here.
Hey, we really appreciate you joining us. So tell me a little bit. I appreciate the head of brand. What does a head of buzz do at CoSchedule?
I always joke that this sounds like the most millennial job title in the world, doesn't it? Head of brand and buzz. Really my role is to make sure that CoSchedule, that our story is being told to as many people as possible. And we're creating buzz around our organization and our product and our company and our people. It's a really fun job. I used to be, head of PR and community, but it just didn't quite encompass what I was doing every day. And so we had some fun with the title. I think it does a good job of kind of illustrating what I get to do every day, which includes hosting a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say the podcast has got to be a big part of that buzz factor, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is great. Thanks so much for having me on the show. It's kind of fun to have the tables turned and to get interviewed instead of interviewing for a living. So
yeah, it's always a little bit different when you're a podcast host and you flip the script and are a guest on a show. So we appreciate you taking a little time out of your normal interviewing schedule. So you touched on your background a little bit. You made the title switch, which I agree. I think head of brand and buzz is definitely cooler than that previous title. And it sounds like it's lining up with what you're doing as well as just, sounding better. But tell us a little bit more about your background and the path to podcasting at CoSchedule.
Yeah, absolutely. The short story is, my background, the majority of it has been in the technology field, really focusing on digital marketing, direct marketing. Did a long stint doing a lot of market automation and email marketing for a while. Worked in an agency for about 8 years on the digital side. And now find myself at a startup again at CoSchedule. I just love, I'm addicted to the energy of startups. Unlimited possibilities, the ability to pivot quickly and really do some focused growth marketing stuff. And the podcast, really how it came to be. So I've been at CoSchedule going on 2 years now, and the podcast really didn't become part of my role until really the last 2 or 3 months. And I think that the reason was we looked at what was the podcast. It landed on the demand gen team right now, but when we think about podcasting, we didn't really think about our podcast as a demand gen tactic, and it made a lot more sense. So my role was a lot of influencer marketing. So I'm building connections, relationships with a lot of the big marketing influencers. And so a big part of this, of a podcast is finding the most wicked smart, guests you can have on your show. And I had built tons of relationships, and they're like, Eric, I used to know you used to do high school drama. So I know you've got a flair for to have conversations and not being shy with these influencers. Why don't you take this thing over? We think you are the perfect person to do this. And I didn't hesitate for a second at all, Logan. It was a perfect opportunity for me. I jumped right into it. I had tons of things to learn, obviously, and I'm still learning, but really enjoy the opportunity to just talk to people who are so smarter in their industry and be able to share that with our audience as well. So
yeah, I'm very much like-minded with you. I enjoy it for a lot of those reasons. So we're going to dive into some of the benefits and some of the lessons learned specifically for you guys in having your podcast for a while now. Give us a little bit about the context of your show, the Actionable Marketing Podcast. Who's it for? Who you're interviewing? And where are you guys at today? Episode number wise, things like that.
yeah, you bet. So I'm really, and I mentioned this before that we started, but I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants who were before me. So Nathan and Jordan on our team started the podcast over 2 years ago. We're in our third year of the Actionable Marketing Podcast, episode 110, 111. We do for one a week is our cadence. And really the show got started because CoSchedule had done a fantastic job. And we still do. We have a very, very powerful, highly visited marketing blog. And we thought, how do we continue to create thought leadership in the space? People like to consume information and learn differently with it. Why don't we start a podcast? And so Nathan, again, like over 2 years ago, literally was in like at the basement with a mic he bought, from Best Buy, and started the Actionable Actually, wasn't called the Action Mark. It was called the Actionable Content Marketing Podcast. And we made the shift to Actionable Marketing Podcast because we wanted to cover a lot more than just content marketing. There's so many things that are on a marketer's plate that they have to think about and be proficient at, that we knew that this was going to be an opportunity for us to talk to a wide array of marketing experts and really kind of broaden that appeal, I think, to our show. And we chose Actionable Marketing Podcast because if you are a follower of the CoSchedule blog, you will find there will not be more of a deep dive property blog out there. Every post is like 2,000 plus words, tons of downloadable resources. And so we want to make sure when someone's done, they can go kick butt. And that's the same philosophy with our podcast. When you listen to our podcast, we try to have fun. Absolutely. I like to ask some fun questions, but if someone's not leaving that podcast without a couple of things they can go and implement ASAP, I have not done my job as a podcast host. And so that's really the idea around, listen, use your time wisely. When you're done with the podcast, go kick butt with your marketing activities. So that's a quick synopsis of the podcast and where it stands today.
Yeah. And the history lesson all the way back to the basement. Yeah. I love that, man. So I think you guys are doing a great thing focusing on the benefit to the listener to create valuable content in making it very actionable, as the name of your show points to. What has been the biggest benefit for you guys as a team, at the marketing team at CoSchedule, since having this podcast now that you guys are a ways into it?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to pinpoint just one. I think there's a lot of different benefits in doing a podcast. I think the one that I really enjoy is we want to be seen as thought leaders in the marketing industry. And so we want to make sure everything that we do is, how am I helping a marketer be better at their job? And we saw the podcast as another way that we can do that. How can we be the marketer's friend? And we have, because of now the brand equity that we've built, we have the ability to reach out to the biggest names in the marketing industry and have them as guests on our show. And not everyone gets a chance to do that. You might get lucky enough to bump into Jay Baer or Ann Hanley at a conference and have like a 3-minute conversation. But I get to sit down, have 20, 30 minutes and really just pick their brain. And then I think that's really big for us, is now we're having our brand next to that influencer's brand, and we get to rub off on each other, right? I think it's kind of a quid pro quo. And that's a really big thing, is building those relationships with really important people in the industry, I think is extremely important. I think too, it's and I mentioned this, it's providing another way for our listeners and our audience to learn, to be better at their job. And the podcast allows us to do that. And let's be honest, this is the third thing, is we're just selfish. Like, we ask people that we want to learn from, like, hey, we're thinking of maybe starting to do some outbound marketing activity. Why don't we ask like the smartest person that we know and outbound and have them on our show and just ask them all the questions that we want to know so that we can start to implement this at our company. So we really we're a lot like any other marketer out there. We're trying to find our way. We don't have all the answers. And so we get to ask them, we get to have a podcast and ask them what those tough questions, and how do we get started? And that's really about what the show can do for us and for our listeners.
I think you make so many great points there, Eric. I don't even know where to start. There were so many specific things you're talking about. I think, a lot of folks think about building an audience and they think about, the brand, the buzz, as is in your title, the thought leadership. But I find it really interesting that you guys have found that benefit in building relationships, in opening doors to influencers, maybe referral partners, or even just other thought leaders in the space where you wouldn't have been able to build a relationship with them had it not been for the podcast. What do you think, is kind of repeatable there for other podcasters to think about? Did you guys go into it thinking about those guest relationships, or did that kind of surprise you as you kind of got into it, either, as a team or you once you kind of jumped in?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think when we got started, I would have to ask Nathan about that one. I think really, Nathan saw this as an extension of our blog and he saw an opportunity to continue to educate people. I think the idea of like, wait a second here, we can really help develop and expand our opportunity to connect with these influencers. I think that's really sort of popped up in the last year or so. And I want to be candid, Logan, like, when we started the Actionable Marketing Podcast, we we might have made the asks, but we didn't really have the clout to go to some of the biggest names, right? I mean, these guests, they're doing their due diligence. They want to know, how many listeners you have. And so we started small, like everyone, let's talk to our customers. Let's talk to people who are using our solution, who are on the front lines of marketing. What are they doing? Let's talk to some of our coworkers, right? Like we have really wicked smart people at our own company. Let's talk to our product marketer, talk about how they're creating conversion copy for the sales and marketing funnel. Like that stuff is really good content. Now, I wasn't able to bring on some of those influencers at first, but slowly you start to gain a listenership and you start to make for a couple of those big acts. And then once you get that first, big fish, you're like, would you like to do the same show that Rand Fishkin from Moz, was on? Like you can start to use that in your pitches. Yep. And I think that's where it's like, okay, now we're at the second phase of our podcast. Now I can just really crush it. And I think of influencers and I think of their reach and our brand affinity, being coupled with that, every one of my podcasts now as an important opportunity that we can't miss.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. There's a path there, though, to connect with those influencers, right? You start out, create some great content internally, then look at some existing clients. Might be a great way to pick their brain and get a case study written anyway, right? And create a new episode for your podcast. Then maybe you go to some people who are maybe partners, or you go to some folks who've engaged with you but never, don't have a working relationship, and then you work your way out from there. But there's definitely a path in that networking aspect. So it sounds like that's been true of your story, and we've very much seen that as well. What can you speak to, Eric, as far as, the ROI or what you guys have measured as a success? What are some of the benchmarks you've looked at, either, new relationships, listenership, additional content? What are some of the things that you guys are looking at and have seen as some of the wins in having a podcast for as long as you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, some of the easy statistics are always going to be, number of subscribers and downloads. We're lucky enough to have, at this point now, hundreds of thousands of downloads, which is fantastic. And so we keep an eye on, how many downloads do we get with every episode. And the big part there is, it justifies, hey, we've got a good listenership. I'm feeling great about this. I also get to see what content is really resonating with my listeners and which isn't. If I'm really going down, maybe I'm talking a little bit more about conversion copy, and then I have another episode that's talking about being creative, and I'm seeing a spike in one or the other. That helps me understand, okay, the listeners who I have right now are really passionate about this particular topic. So it's a measurable. It's also an indicator of maybe what I should do more of, which I think I would love to recommend all podcasters do. I think second is absolutely, I think we look at number of relationships. Like I can email with an influencer all day long, but when I get to sit down and just have a nice kind of casual conversation like you and I are, Logan, like that sticks with them. I'm able to have a fun conversation And next time I see them, I reach out, we kind of have this relationship already built, and I can ask them for a favor, or I can say, what can I do for you? And those things sometimes are immeasurable. That's just part of, of my world as brand and buzz.
Mhm.
Not everything is as measurable as I would hope it would be. So
Mhm.
there is some intangible. We get anecdotally, hey, we listen to the podcast. Like I'll hear our sales team. Well, I've told them to go out of their way. I'm like, hey, if you're on a prospect call and anyone talks about our podcast, man, you slack me right away and let me know. And it's happened. Every other week or so, like, hey, just want to let you know, I was on a prospect call. Someone said they listened to the podcast, a big fan. Like, boom,
Mhm.
it's totally anecdotal, but it's one of those things that's like, okay, I know we're making an impact on a variety of different things. I'm growing my
Mhm.
listenership. They're building a relationship with the CoSchedule brand, right? How do you put a
Mhm.
price tag on that? Like, I love Jay Bear says, how do you equate the value of your mom, right? Like, what's the value of, you can't like on some of these things, and I'm probably misquoting him, but I'm paraphrasing maybe, but like those are things that are hard to quantify. But then there are some of the really tangible things. Like I could look at downloads, I could look at traffic driven, I can see how that's performing. I can think about different ways to distribute my podcast and how am I tweaking those numbers. And those things I think give me the at least enough to feel like what I'm working on is working or not working, so to
Mhm.
speak. And
Yeah.
I think that's the best sometimes you can hope for with podcasts. Now, I'm open to all ears, Logan. You maybe have more ways that people are measuring, but I think those things have worked really well for us.
Yeah. I think you touched on two things there, Eric, that are really, really great. One is that qualitative difference in the relationships that you want to build between your brand and buyers or influencers in your target market. I can tell you for a fact that when we have a repeat guest on our podcast, there is a different feel to that conversation. The relationship is to a different level. And I think that as you talk about things, and oftentimes we frame our kind of topic selection with our guest, it's starting out with what's something that's top of mind for you? What are you passionate about? And then let's get granular from there. When you're talking to guests about something they're passionate about and they've, found a success or they're sharing a story that others can learn from, there's a connection there. And so I really love the one-to-one connection, much like you, Eric, that you're getting while you're informing the one-to-many. And like you said, there are, other aspects there that do lead to lead generation and referrals and those things like that. One other area we've looked at for our clients is how the content from the podcast, similar to what you said, informs the rest of your content strategy. As you mentioned, kind of looking at, okay, this topic's really resonating. We should do more on this. And I think a lot of podcasters could go further into, repurposing that audio content into other formats as it feeds and kind of directs your content strategy. So that was the other thing that I heard from you that we're very much leaning into as well. So that's great to hear that it's been something you guys have seen as well. I wanted to ask you about any unexpected benefits you've seen from the podcast. And I think you kind of alluded to this maybe earlier, is in talking about how much you guys have learned and been able to gain knowledge from your guests as you're creating content for your audience. Do you think that's probably been the biggest one?
That's huge. I think, it's naive to think as just because we're a podcast host, or we like to think that, we're definitely want to be thought leaders in the marketing industry, but to think that we know everything there is to know about every single facet or avenue of marketing is just ridiculous, right? Like we're a
Mhm.
sponge, and I think there's a level of authenticity that you as a podcaster, when you're interviewing and when you're excited and passionate about a topic, yeah, we purposely we want to know. We want to know, again, like I talked about, like, hey, we're going to grow into this particular area. We don't know anything about it. Like we can certainly read, but wouldn't it be cool, if we interviewed someone who is a thought leader in that particular area? Because at the end of the day, I think it's a service to us. It's a service to our listeners. It's a
Mhm.
win-win. And I think it's about being strategic, because if we're having this issue, common sense would tell us that the majority of our listeners maybe, run into the same issue or had the same type of questions. And I think that definitely was something that I didn't really think about at all. And that was a nugget that Nathan passed along to me. He's like, hey, he's like, don't be afraid to be selfish. If you're just really curious about a particular topic
Mhm.
when it comes to marketing, like, go for it, right? Because the chances are your audience is going to have those same questions. I'm like, amen, brother. I'm so on board with that. I think so. That's a great thing to think about when you're choosing your guests. Of course, I think there's also some strategy that should be put into play. Like, what do you want to be known for? So we try to do topics that are, I would say, complementary or parallel to a lot of the services that our product offers as well, right? Even with the content we have on our blog, there should be some sort of association, additional value add to what our team and our product and our company can provide to a marketing listener that has some kind of an extension about what we're talking about on the podcast as well. So I think there's also that opportunity to have some overlap about what your product, we don't very rarely ever talk about the CoSchedule product on our podcast. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
But I know that the same topics and pain points, a lot of those value adds can be accomplished with what our product delivers. And so that's just smart, that's just smart topic association, doing some keyword research, I think, on top of that as well. So
yeah, just good content marketing. I love that. So one final question, Eric, what's one piece of advice you would give to a room full of marketers or a group thinking about starting a podcast for their team, for their brand? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I have to give the same advice. I actually did a podcast about how to start a podcast about a month ago or 6 weeks ago with Nathan and Jordan. And they had some great advice that I'm going to go ahead and regurgitate and spread to all of your listeners, Logan. And that would be don't let the fear or the complexity of a podcast get in your way. Start simple and just ship the first episode. I talked about Nathan was literally in his basement. He bought, like $100 mic, from Best Buy, and he bought a quick program that was able to record. Skype is how we particularly do ours. And that was it from an investment standpoint. Just start having interviews. I think sometimes we're like the victim of HGTV, right? Like we see all these beautiful homes and we buy our first home. We want this perfect home, right? Oh, sorry, that costs $500,000. Maybe I won't have.
Right.
Same thing with podcasts. We grow, as a marketer, we're probably, or as a podcast listener and fan, you're probably listening to these really well professionally produced things and thinking, that's what I need to have right out the gates. And I think starting simple, shipping something, and then building your number of podcasts that you have, you get experience, you start to build the listenership, and you iterate. I think that's the important word there is learn and get better with each podcast you have. I was telling you this, I'm sitting now in this fancy podcast room, soundproof, that's not how it started here. And if we would have waited for that, we didn't even know if it was going to work for us. So you don't want to put all this investment into something that really hasn't even been proven to be beneficial for you yet. So just start with what you have, ship, and then see what happens and iterate, right?
That is fantastic. We have definitely learned that lesson in producing our own show and in over 800 episodes. And we're constantly kind of tweaking our service as we help launch podcasts for our clients to find, what's effective for specific clients. What are some different things that we can tweak? Recently, we started helping our clients, sprinkle in solo episodes in addition to interview-based shows. And that was a lesson that we learned out of our own show and looking at some of the analytics and looking at, hey, this is resonating with people. Maybe there's something here that our clients can lean into as well. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think that is fantastic advice, Eric. Well, I have enjoyed this entire conversation. Obviously, I could chat podcasting all day long. If anybody would like to reach out to you, Eric, learn more about your experience podcasting, learn more about CoSchedule, or find the Actionable Marketing Podcast, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Sure. If they want to hit us up on email, it's just podcast@coschedule.com. Happy to chat with you more about podcasting there. coschedule.com/podcast is where you can find the Actionable Marketing Podcast, or we're on Spotify, we're on iTunes, we're on all the major podcast platforms. And that's, again, Actionable Marketing Podcast. Take a listen. Hope you enjoy it.
I love it. Thanks again for being on the show, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Logan. This was a blast.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.